We're on? All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see everybody. And welcome to our Wednesday night class in Hollywood on the Zera Shimshon. I'm getting a lot of questions. Rabbi, is your Monday night class the same as your Wednesday night class? And the answer is? No. All right, very good. The Monday evening class is in general on the Parashat. Anyone who listened to it, I'm sure you enjoyed it. If you didn't, spend the time in the car or somewhere to listen. You could subscribe on our Facebook page, on our YouTube page, so this way, just in case you're traveling, you'll be able to see it. And the Wednesday night class is the Zera Shimshon. Both on the Parsha, both different perspectives completely. Not one's greater than the other, just it's different views and outlooks on our Torah portion of the week. This evening's class is dedicated by a dear friend of mine, by Mr. Joel and Jacqueline Goldman, for two very special reasons. First reason is in honor of my brother being with us this evening, Adam, which Joel's very close with, so that's very nice. Thank you, Joel. And second is for Refuah Shlema for Yaakov Azriel ben Gedalia Shlomo. May he have a speedy recovery, a miraculous recovery, Be'ezrat Hashem, in the merit of learning Torah, in the merit of sponsoring Torah, and in the merit of the Zera Shimshon, Zichuto Yagen Alenu. Amen. Amen. This week we are learning Parashat Vayeshev, and it is no less interesting and amazing than the previous Parasha, being that Yaakov Avinu is still the main character at the beginning of the portion, but then we segue into the next amazing biblical character that the Torah is introducing to us, and that is Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph. Joseph was a very special individual, but before we get into Joseph, I want to just go into how Jacob actually gets home. Jacob leaves his father-in-law's house, and he was chased by his father-in-law. He was about to meet his brother. We learned about this last week. He overcomes that test, and life doesn't get much easier for him. He has the issue with his daughter Dinah. That was also a burden. Rachel, the love of his life, the wife that he always dreamed of, passes away during childbirth, giving birth to Binyamin. And now, at the age of 99, Yaakov Avinu decides to return back home. He's 99 years old, okay? He gets home, and his son Yosef is 8 years old. So he's still a little baby. They get home, they see Yitzchak. We learned last week that Rachel already passed away. So he gets home and he's spending time with his father Isaac. Most of the time Yaakov does and spends when he gets home to Israel is spending time learning Torah with his father and with his son. Like, could you imagine anything greater? Just sitting and enjoying the company of your father and your son and just growing in wisdom and in self-perfection and in really indulging in the Torah in a very deep and beautiful way. The Torah tells us that Yaakov is seeking to, so to say, relax, to enjoy life. The Torah says, very first verse, this is the beginning of chapter 37, Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz megure aviv be'eretz Kenan. And Jacob returns. Lashuv is to return. He returns home to the home of his fathers. Also, as Rashi tells us, that Jacob was asking to dwell in peace, to relax. After all, he's had a hard 36 years. Where was he over the past 36 years? He was literally breaking his brains for 14 years in the yeshiva. He was swindled by his father-in-law, 7 years working for him, and another 7 years working for him. His most favorite wife couldn't have any children. Finally, she has a child. He works another 6 years for himself. He gets chased, and then we just said all of the hardships. Doesn't he really deserve to relax? I mean, I got to catch my breath after all that excitement. That's a lot. It's a lot for Yaakov, and he's no whippersnapper. 99. He's 99 today. He's been suffering for the past 36 years. It's not been easy, being sent away by your parents. So what's so wrong with him asking to, as Rashi puts it, dwell in peace? A little bit of relaxing. Furthermore, the Zera Shimshon asks this question, and he proposes an answer and then asks on this answer. And I'm just giving a blanket statement. Today's class is extremely deep. But don't worry, I put hours into trying to simplify it and make it attainable for everybody, and also to pull out a practical lesson. So this is what we like doing. We like going very, very deep, and at the same time making it very, very practical. So the Zera Shimshon says as follows. He says that there's a rule. The rule Hashem put in our own Torah. I'm going to quote you the verse. The verse is in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 11. If you want to write that down, that's 7:11. Hey, that's good, no? 7:11 in Deuteronomy says as follows. Hayom la'asotam. Today, all of the laws of the Torah, we're supposed to fulfill them when? Hayom, today. The Talmud tells us, Hayom la'asotam u'machar litol secharam. Today is when we work hard fulfilling the mitzvot, and tomorrow, when's tomorrow? After we pass on in the world to come is when we reap the benefits, the rewards, and the merits from all the good deeds we did in this world. And the Zera Shimshon gives an analogy. It's Hashem does the following. Sometimes He bestows blessing and extra success on a person independent of whatever they do. Independent if they're good, independent if they're bad. Hashem sometimes gives others, even though the main blessing and reward is in the world to come. He gives the analogy of, imagine someone who borrows something from somebody. They have the ability to return it earlier to their lender. If I borrow from you $100, I can give it back to you the next day. I can give it back to you in 100 days. I can give it back to you by the deadline. So too, God is able to give what He, quote-unquote, owes a righteous person even in this world. He doesn't need to wait for the world to come. On that, the Zera Shimshon, he's puzzled and he says, one second, go back to that analogy of the borrower and the lender. If the lender comes and requests to be paid back early, let's say it was a 30-day loan, and the guy comes back after 2 weeks. Can you pay me today? If the person comes and says he's not able to, can the lender get angry? No. Okay, can the borrower? And also not. Neither of them can get angry because it's earlier than the mandated time, than the deal. So the Zera Shimshon is bothered. Why did Hashem, A, not grant Yaakov asking to be paid part of his merits in this world? B, he gets angry at him. C, he punishes him. What's the next thing that happens right after Jacob asks to relax? Problems with Joseph come. We'll explain exactly that. But then all the problems of his most favorite, his preferred child, jump on him like challenges that he never imagined before. Ones that no one should ever encounter in their life. So Zera Shimshon is bothered by, okay, Jacob is asking to be paid back early. He's being asked to be paid his merits and his reward in this world. So why punish him? Why would Hashem get angry? Why would Hashem not grant him his wish? He's 99 years old. Let him spend the last part of his life enjoying and dwelling in peace. So the Zera Shimshon brings our attention to a part of the Talmud in the beginning of Tractate Brachot. That's the very first volume in the Talmud on page 7. On page 7, there's a discussion in the Talmud of Moses coming to God and asking God 3 requests. The first request is that he should place his Shekhinah, his very own holy presence, amongst the Jews. That's the first. The second is that he should not place his presence with the Gentiles. Rather, that blessing should be exquisite to the Jewish people, to the chosen people. And the third is he asks God about his ways, his calculations, something which is very hard for us to sometimes understand. So the first 2, he was answered on. God promised that he will dwell, his Shekhinah, his holy presence, amongst the Jews, and that not so for the Gentiles. However, did God ever answer Moses on his last request? And this was the explanation of the last request. How do you explain to me, God? Moses tells him, God, how do you explain to me when there's a righteous person and they have it good for themselves? And there is a righteous person and they're suffering. They're both righteous. Is that fair? Okay, how do you explain another scenario? You have a wicked person and it's going bad for them. And you have a wicked person and it looks like they're blessed. It looks like everything's good for them. Moses comes to God and says, explain me that. It's not fair. One person's doing good and he's getting blessed. Another person's doing good, he's getting punished. And vice versa. An evil person is being blessed or cursed. What's the reason for this? Moses asks God. So, there is a dispute in the Talmud if God actually answered Moses or not. Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, says, God answered him. You know what the answer is? The answer is that a tzaddik gamur, as we say in Hebrew, someone who is fully righteous, gets blessed even in this world. But a non-fully righteous person, it's called tzaddik she'eno gamur, a not completely righteous person, won't have it perfect in this world, won't have it too good. And the opposite is true. An evil person who is super evil, who's fully wicked, he'll be punished for it. But if you're wicked, but you're not completely wicked, you could still have it good in this life. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Meir says, no. Moses was never, ever answered on this. Rather, it is beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our lexicon of understanding God's calculations. This is the dispute in the Talmud. One opinion is it's based on your deeds. A person's blessing and reciprocation from God in this world is dependent on one's deeds. And the other is based on, Rabbi Meir says, it's based on mazal. We don't know the calculation. In the world to come, in the world of truth, everything's going to be open. All of our checks, all of our X's, and everything will be reconciled, and we'll really understand why anything and everything happened to us and even to others. But in this world, Rabbi Meir says, we don't know. This is a calculation that is beyond our comprehension. Based on this, the Zera Shimshon says, now we could understand how come Yaakov Avinu was punished. What was Yaakov Avinu wanting? He was wanting to dwell in peace. He was wanting to be reciprocated, to be paid for his merits that he deserved. In essence, what does that mean he's coming to do? He's coming and saying that the true answer in that dispute we just mentioned is like the first opinion, like the opinion that it's based on one's deeds that a person is reciprocated for and blessed for in this world. It's based on one's deeds. Hashem had a problem with that. Because the truth is, it is a dispute that is unknown to us. If Jacob was going to claim his reward now, claim his reward today, do you know what that would result in? The Zera Shimshon says that would result in other righteous people who maybe would not have such a tranquil and peaceful life, for others to look at that person and say they must not be righteous. Because if Jacob was so righteous and he got the blessing and the promise of having a peaceful rest of his life, then it must mean that it's based on a person's deeds, on how they enjoy or have suffering in this world. But if that person's suffering, it must mean they're not so complete. So for the sake of righteous people, God said, you know what, for Jacob, we're not going to give him the potential, the possibility of resting peacefully for the rest of his life. Because he asked for it. He gives an example. The Gemara in Masechet Ketubot, page 103, says, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, are we familiar with the name? Very famous name. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was the author of our Mishnayot. All of the oral Torah, the original transcription of the oral Torah, was compiled by this holy man, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Until him, from the time of Moses, all the way into the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, it was all transmitted. All of the oral law that was transmitted by God to Moses was transmitted orally. But then there was a issue. People started forgetting what was the opinion, what was actually said. So Rabbi Nasi took upon himself to gather all of the Torah scholars and ask them what their opinions were on the different issues or the different questions and laws and traditions that as the Jewish people had as a transmission from Moses. So listen to how fascinating this rabbi is. Amazing rabbi. He would his whole life make sure that he'd be the one who does Kiddush Friday night for his family. Many of us do this as well. It's the man of the household. It could be the father, it could be the grandfather. So Rabbi Nasi always, ever since he was, eligible to do it, he always made sure that he blessed the Kiddush on Friday night. But now the Talmud goes a step further. The Talmud says that even after Rabbi Nasi passed away, he continued to come back and do Kiddush for his family. Amazing, no? Until a certain something happened. Until the neighbors found out that their deceased father and grandfather is coming back and doing Kiddush for them, he stopped. Why would he stop? For the same reason. He stopped because he didn't want anyone else to think that any other righteous person that passed away, they must not be fully righteous or so righteous because they're not coming back and doing Kiddush for their family. So even though he was able to, even though he was granted to, but in order not to shed a negative light on any other sage or any other righteous person, he stopped himself. The same goes by Yaakov Avinu. Zera Shimshon says that Yaakov Avinu Jacob had no other righteous people that were living in his lifetime except for his immediate family. Everyone would understand. Abba had a hard life so far. He's asking for some merit. He wants to withdraw a little of his merit of the world to come. Okay, he deserves it. No, but Hashem said on purpose, He's not going to give Jacob any of the merit now, even for the future generations. We don't want to think that the only way a person can prove that they are fully righteous is if they are having a pleasant life. Hashem said that's not the way of the world. It's a dispute which is not answered. It's a dispute which is above the comprehension of our finite brains, and therefore he was not about to give this to Jacob over ruining that or shedding a negative light on any sage or any tzaddik or tzadeket, righteous man or woman that was going to come and maybe suffer in life. So listen to the following two applications I wanted to bring out from this piece of the Zera Shimshon. The first is, we have to ask ourselves, why would Hashem even get angry at Jacob? Getting angry at Jacob for wanting to rest? So we understand why he wasn't granted. But the Rashi and the commentary say that Hashem got so to say, angry at Jacob and then gave him the challenge of Joseph. That's very tough. So listen to a look, or let's say an opinion on this whole concept. What is the reason that God does not grant success automatically when someone does something good? I mean, let's face it. We all know that we're supposed to make a blessing before we eat and drink. So, I don't know, if I want to be radical, if I want to be a radical God, I would say, you make the blessing. I did it already, okay? You can drink and you swallow and you survive. You don't make the blessing, i.e., as the Talmud puts it, as you're stealing. A person should drink and choke, chas v'shalom. Right? It should be so simple. You do the right thing, the right thing happens. You do the wrong thing, it should not happen. It should be so simple that when a person steals money that's not theirs, it should be obvious and blatant that money gets lost or misplaced, or like a real sign from God, like, hey, you did the wrong thing, and it's just so open. Why isn't life like that? Sometimes afterwards, in retrospect, you get to look back at what you did or what you didn't do, and you say, wow, because I did this, I was rewarded. Or because I did this, I was punished. But it's not obvious, and it's not every single action. Why not? It's a good question, huh? Anyone? I'm opening the floor. I don't do this often.
Well, it doesn't give you a chance to do tshuva later and change your mind, do more of a better thing later on.
Okay, you're like 90% there?
You just answered the question. If you took it that literal, and if I forget to make a bracha, and Hashem's punishment is I'm going to choke.
No. Not forgetting.
I don't want to be judged.
Okay, difference between forgetting. We're not talking forgetting. If a person forget and make a mistake, fine. But if you intentionally look at this cup and you say, this doesn't belong to God, it belongs to me, instead of mentioning Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shakol neh bidvaro, imagine, okay? This belongs, and then you drink, you should choke, right? A person who eats pork, eats shellfish, eats non-kosher. How come can they survive? How come are they fit? How come are they strong?
Maybe.
Yeah. Oh, very good.
The consequences and the rewards that you get can't be right away. Otherwise, there would be no aspect of free will.
That's it. There's the answer. So we had at least three people, that all had that idea in mind. This would completely ruin the concept of free will. Free will, let me give you a quick rundown on free will. Free will is an hour class just in and of itself. I'm going to give it to you in a couple minutes. Okay? Because it's a big question. And this also answers the question of, how do I have free will if God knows what I'm going to do? He knows I've done it already. Right? So how does that work? Listen to the following. Free will is a concept of having an equal choice. The choice always has to be equal for me to choose to do the right thing or the wrong thing. As long as it's too easy for me to do the right thing, that's not free will anymore. It's not free. As much as free will as each and every one of us have to turn on the stove at home and put our hand on it, no one's doing that. Why? Because you've either happened to you once by mistake, or you've seen that happen by somebody. You know what the result is. That's not free will. It's not free will to walk into and say, I'm not turning on the stove and putting my hand on it. That's obvious. If it would be so obvious that every time someone eats something kosher versus eats something non-kosher, that the result would be so blatant and open right then and there, that's not free will anymore. It would not be free will that every single person who, take any example, who gives charity, who prays, who keeps Shabbat, who does all the 613 mitzvot, that as soon as they do it, they get reciprocated for it, that's not free will anymore. The Talmud refers to it, the Zohar also refers to it in an Aramaic term. It's an interesting term. If you remember this, you'll sound very scholarly. Okay, it's called Nahama de Chesufa. Nahama means bread. Chesufa means shame. Ever since, this the Zohar explains, ever since Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, they were opened up to a different world. Their eyes, their souls, they saw the world in a different way. They also understood the idea of merit and dismerit, reward and punishment in a completely different way, to the point where, deep down inside, each and every person in every realm would prefer to earn their bread than to be given it to it in a way of bread of shame. There's earning something, there's making it, there's toiling and building for it, or there's hand-me-down. This is the difference of free will or not. It's not free will if the result is obvious on if I do the right thing or not. That's not free will anymore. So you know why God got angry with Abraham? Because Abraham was going to tamper, inadvertently, obviously. Sorry, Yaakov. Jacob was going to inadvertently tamper with the whole concept of free will. Because if he would have been rewarded in his lifetime, then every other future sage, future righteous man or woman would all expect, if I do the right thing, well then I should get rewarded. And if I don't do the right thing, well that's why I'm being punished. And that's not the way of God. Okay, so that's the first lesson. The first lesson is the idea of free will. God always wants to preserve free will. The second is something that we need to work on towards ourselves and towards our fellows. You know how easy it is to pass judgment? You look at somebody, they normally do the right thing, but then they do something wrong in your eyes. Whatever it is, take an example, any example. And then you hear that that person lost their business, someone in their family passed away, they hurt themselves, they're in a cast, any type of tragedy. Maybe somewhere in the back of our minds we say, that person deserves it. Maybe deep down, that person really deserves it. God, the Zera Shimshon, is telling us that's not true. You cannot look at a person's life, their success and blessing, and or their suffering or their failures, as a barometer or as an indicator of if that person is truly righteous or not. Why? Because this is a concept that is beyond the comprehension of our finite minds. The Zera Shimshon reminds us, when you look at somebody and it looks like everything is going good for them, it means nothing about what type of a person they are. Someone's wealthy, someone's healthy, they look happy, they have a family, everything looks good for them. That has nothing to do with with the fact that they are either a good person or a bad person in the eyes of God. And the same is the opposite. Sometimes you look at somebody and they're such a good person, they have such a good heart, they're such a great person, all they do is good to others, they teach, they help, they're always available, but they're suffering. So what? Do we need to think that person's doing something wrong? No! That's the life that God has set out for that person. That's the struggles, and that's the blessing in disguise that God has for that person. The same we need to look at ourselves. Sometimes, and this happens more often than not, the person commits to do something good, something noteworthy, for God, for their own growth. And then stuff starts getting tricky. A person decides that they want to start keeping Shabbat. In essence, what keeping Shabbat means is that you could only have a possibility of working 24/6 instead of 24/7. Simple math, each and any one of us. If I'm working 6 days a week, full time, put all my efforts into it, compared to if I'm working 7 days a week, how am I going to make more money? How am I going to have more blessing? If I work 7 days, I'm putting 1/7 more, right? It's like if you have me come over to your house and do something and spend 6 hours on it or 7 hours on it. Obviously that extra hour is definitely meaningful. A whole other day of work. No? That means whatever you made in 7 years, you could have made in 6 years. However way you chop it up or you slice it, rationally, if you work 7 days a week, you should be making more. So you know what you do? From this point on, I commit to not work on Shabbat. That's it. No business. Absolutely no business. Why? The Torah tells me I'm going to have blessing if I do so. God says He's going to provide if I do so. Do you know how many people commit to keeping Shabbat and commit to not working on Shabbat? Guess which way their business goes? No. It goes down. Why would it go down? Tell me why it would go down. You know why? Because God's testing you to see if it's for real or not. Are you doing it by chance? Are you doing it because you're looking for the financial gain? Or are you doing it because God told you to do it? And this is the reason why we're not allowed to judge others, or we shouldn't even judge ourselves based on the situation we're in. You may be in a complicated, complex, hard situation. It doesn't necessarily mean you're doing the wrong things. You may be very comfortable, very great. Didn't we learn last week that that's a reason to worry? The Zera Shimshon taught us that when you're comfortable and everything's going great, when you feel no need to worry, that's when you should start worrying. And this is so true, because do not look at your life and look at how everything is going and say that, now I got to a conclusion whether I'm doing the right thing or not. No. You could make the right decisions, and Hashem could tighten it and make it stronger for you. Why? That's His calculation. So again, the 3 lessons we learned from this portion was, number 1, the idea of free will. God did not want Abraham to tamper with free will, not for himself and not for the future generations to come. Secondly, Secondly, a person should never look at someone else's situation and then start judging them whether they're good or bad, and same too, thirdly, for ourselves. We should never judge ourselves and say, based on our situation, we're either doing good or bad. Sometimes, when you're in tune with yourself, when you're in tune with your soul, when you're in tune with your emotions, yes, you could sometimes see what happens in life and say, well, that was signs from God. But in general, don't get down over when stuff start getting hard. Don't get down and don't regress when you're making forward steps towards the right things and everything wrong starts happening. No, that's God trying to see if you're really strong, and you really want to stick on to the commitment that you made. This is the first portion. We've got 2 more to go. Next. This is a connection with the Jacob now getting into his challenge of Joseph. Now, prior to the challenge of Joseph, Jacob is showing a tremendous amount of favoritism on his most favorite son, which as parents we learn that we should not do. We learn from Jacob never to show favoritism onto one child or one grandchild over the other, because it creates nothing but animosity and jealousy. Don't do it. Even though the children need to know that not everyone gets the same thing, not everyone gets the same amount of time or the same items or the same education even, right? Some kids, a parent will do everything to put them into law school. But your other child, you know they can't be a lawyer. You won't spend the time and the money and the efforts on putting them through law school. That's not favoritism. But as parents, we need to voice that to our children and explain them how we love and treat each one equally based on their needs. A famous line that I like to use. I heard this first from my wife. You tell your children, your grandchildren this, you get what you get and you don't get upset. This is very important. You know, one child gets something and they say, but I want... You get what you get and you don't get upset. That is true between siblings, and that's true between your children and neighbors and other kids in school. Kids always come in with great things, amazing things, new shoes, new bag, new this, new game. You get what you get and you don't get upset. I tried using that on my wife. It didn't work. So, Jacob, unfortunately, at his tremendous level, failed in not showing the outright favoritism towards his son Joseph. He gives him this gorgeous coat, colorful, amazing coat, very special one. He spent so much time with this son, it was obvious he was his favorite. He has 12 sons. Who's he with all the time? His father and Joseph. His father and Joseph. He taught his son Joseph every single piece of Torah he ever learned from his father and from the yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever. Joseph's brothers were shepherds. Joseph was a yeshiva boy. He stayed in the tent all day with his father and his grandfather. Tell me another way of favoritism more than that. Now, we can't blame Jacob for it because, Joseph was Jacob's favorite wife's eldest, but at the end of the day it backfired. And then Joseph becomes a dreamer and he starts telling his brothers all of his fancy dreams, and that creates more jealousy and animosity. And at the age of 17, only 9 years after they arrived to the land of Israel, Jacob tells his son Joseph, go fetch your brothers, call them back, I need to have everyone with me now. And at that time is when Joseph's brothers see him and they say, there's the dreamer, we're going to teach him a lesson. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to kill him because Joseph said 3 derogatory reports to their father, and they believed that they were not at fault of those 3 claims that Joseph was saying. We're not going to get into that now. Refer to our Monday night class and other classes. But they decided they were going to kill him. Reuven, everyone knows Reuven? The eldest of Jacob's sons. He says, how can we live with the blood of our brother on our hands for the rest of our lives? We can't kill him. Let's throw him in a pit. Who knows what was going to be then? He was just trying to delay time and not act rashly or let his brothers kill him out of emotion. And then he gets picked up and sold off as a slave, which we'll get back to. The Talmud, the Zera Shimshon quotes the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat. It's interesting to notice, being that Hanukkah is a couple days away, that the story and the holiday of Purim has a whole tractate in our Talmud called Masechet Megillah. Tractate Megillah, Megillat Esther. Our holiday and our story, our victory of Hanukkah, does not have its own tractate. It has a couple measly pages starting on the 20th page of Masechet Shabbat. Okay? Very different. But we're not going to get into that, but the Zera Shimshon gets into a certain correlation between Hanukkah and our Parsha that are brought in that tractate. So listen to the flow of this piece of Talmud, and the Zera Shimshon is going to ask a question that we would all ask if we would just stop and think, just as we're going to do now. The Talmud brings a halacha, brings a law about the laws of Hanukkah, that if you light your candles over 20 amot, argument's sake, would be 30 feet. If you take your menorah and you place it 30 feet above ground level, above outside, above the street, above the sidewalk, and you light it, you have not fulfilled your obligation. Because people don't see it. That's the first halacha. Next halacha. Then the Talmud quotes and says, there's a verse in this week's Torah portion which is perplexing. 37:24, if anyone's following, chapter 37:24 says as follows. Vayikachuhu vayashlichu oto habora. So the brothers, instead of killing him, they take Joseph and they throw him in the pit. Guess what the Torah says about this pit? Vehabor rek en bo maim. The pit is empty and there's no water. Hold on, the Talmud says. If the pit's empty, I know there's no water in it. So either tell me the pit has no water or the pit's empty. And we know our Torah just doesn't add extra words by chance. There's something to be learned from every word in the Torah. So the Talmud says, you know what? The meaning of the well, the pit, is empty and there's no water. It means it's empty from water specifically. However, there are snakes and scorpions in there. Okay? Then the Talmud goes back. So, first halakha was the height of the menorah. It can't be too high. Second part that the Talmud brings about is this whole idea of a pit by Joseph. It doesn't say anything about Hanukkah. That the pit by Joseph was empty of water but full of snakes and scorpions. Then the Talmud goes back and says, you know where you put the menorah? You put the menorah on the other side of the mezuzah of your house. So if you're going to light at your house, you're going to light by your front door, you're going to have the mezuzah on the right side and the menorah on the left side. So the Zera Shimshon, amongst others, are all perplexed and say, what's the sequence of this Talmud? What are you telling me? Laws of Hanukkah, placement. Then you're taking a break with the story of Joseph and this well. And then you're getting back to the laws of Hanukkah's placement. What's going on? The Zera Shimshon, now you're going to hold with me. I'm going to explain this as clear as possible. But if you really, really hold with me, you're going to be enlightened in a tremendous way. You are going to change your Hanukkah based on this answer. Okay? Get ready. Yehuda, I'm watching you. L'chaim. The Zera Shimshon says, the reason why we light a menorah on Hanukkah is to fulfill what's called in Hebrew Pirsume Nisa. Pirsume Nisa means to outwardly express, publicly proclaim God's miracle that He did, the miracle that He fulfilled and accomplished for the Jewish people back in the time of Hanukkah. By the way, does anyone know exactly to the year how many years ago Hanukkah took place? 2,156 years. Okay? It's a long time ago. So, the Zera Shimshon says, the reason why we light the Hanukkah candle are in order to publicly proclaim this amazing mitzvah that God did for the Jewish people. Now, he asks, why do we fulfill this lighting of the candles based on a seemingly secondary miracle that God did for the Jewish people back then over the main one? Who knows? Who can tell me? Why do we light the Hanukkah candles? Because we found... Very good. We found a miraculous jug of sealed, pure olive oil after the destruction and the turmoil in the temple. And that lasted how long? 8 days. So that's why we have 8 days of Hanukkah. Sounds like a great story. 1 second. The Zera Shimshon says, How come are we paying attention to the finding of a little flask of oil? What was the greater miracle? The victory of the war. The fact that we beat the small amount, beat the large amount. The guerrilla warfare, the primitive type of fighting and weapons, beats major artillery and elephants and submarines and back in the time and jet planes and all the great, amazing technology that they had 2,100 years ago. But the couple rabbis with their canes beat them. Are we like? Isn't that a bigger miracle than finding the oil? If they would have found the oil and lost the war, would it have been a miracle? So Zera Shimshon says the main miracle really is the war. So why are we making a whole to-do, and we're making a whole publication of this grand miracle based on the secondary miracle? It's a good question. It's a fair question. Listen to how he answers. He says we need to rethink the reason why we light the menorah. And he says that really it's both reasons that we light the menorah. One reason is because we found the oil, and the other reason is because we won the war. But how does winning the war, or lighting candles rather, make a public proclamation, an announcement that we won the war? How does that? I mean, in this city maybe not as much, but if you go to many cities around the world, it's lit up. Everything's lit up. Right? The Gentiles took it from us. They put all of their lights around their houses and their trees, and so how's that any different than the light we light? Okay, one's oil, one's electric. Light is light. The Midrash says that the exile that the Jewish people endured from the Greeks, the Greek exile, is referred to as darkness. Okay? This darkness, we have, the Zera Shimshon says, we have the potential to light it up, to shed light on the great Greek exile that we once had back then and every single year. When we light the menorah, we are lighting at a victory for the war. We are shedding light on all the darkness they wanted to bring to the Jewish world. They did not allow us to keep our calendar. They did not allow us to circumcise our boys. They did not allow us to keep Shabbat. They did not allow us to study our holy Torah. They took the soul out of the body of the Jew. They were trying to. So what we do is we reignite our souls with that flame of Torah, with that flame of belief, with that flame of victory every single year on Hanukkah. So the Zera Shimshon says it's really both reasons. It's both reasons we light the menorah. We light because we won and we're shedding light, and we light because we found that flask of oil. And the Zera Shimshon goes to propose, and he's setting up for the next step. He goes to propose, well, let's face it, who brought that exile upon us? Yes, our deeds prompted it, but God brought the Greek exile and allowed them to be strong over us. So of course he put us into that mess. Doesn't he have to take us out of it? Because if he wouldn't take us out of it, well then there would have been no more Jews. It was a time in history, one of the very rare times in history, that the complete world Jewish population was at risk of being exterminated. God has to fulfill his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Moses that there will always be a continuation of this Jewish lineage and people. So how could it be that we need to thank God for something he had to do anyways, Zera Shimshon says? Or maybe he didn't have to do it. So he put us in that mess. Does he need to take us out? Or maybe he does not need to take us out. So the Zera Shimshon, now this is fascinating. So is everyone with me till here? I'm trying to simplify it as much as possible. The Zera Shimshon says the answer to the question if we have an obligation to thank God and proclaim publicly for this miracle is based on a dispute in the Talmud. This part of the Talmud is in Masechet Sanhedrin, page 67b. Look at this. Don't try this at home. This is horrible. But if you were to take a snake, that's already mistake number one. Don't touch snakes. If you picked up a snake and you brought it over to someone else, to their hand, to their face, God forbid, anywhere, and the snake bites that person and kills them, are you fully responsible for that murder or not? Well, what's the question? It's a dispute. Like most things in the Talmud, one opinion says yes, one opinion says no. But let's understand what those opinions are. So, there's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that if you were to grab the snake and bring it over to a fellow, and that fellow gets bitten by the snake and dies, you are fully liable. You know why? Because the venom of a snake is between its teeth, the terminology of the Talmud says. And as soon as a snake opens his mouth and bites on flesh, it's inevitable that the person's going to die because the venom's in between its teeth. The Chachamim, the majority of the sages, say no. Although you're not allowed to do that, but a person cannot be liable for death. So meaning, the Torah says, if you kill somebody and there's witnesses, you are now liable for death yourself. You are completely wrong. You cannot do that. If a person were to take, the Talmud says, the Chachamim say, the rabbis say, if you were to take a snake and you bring it to another person and it bites the person and they die, you're not fully responsible for that murder. You know why? Because they say that the snake has choice when to activate the venom to come out or not. And the very fact that the snake opened his mouth, bit down, and released the venom, the snake himself was involved in that murder. You're fully wrong, but you're not fully liable. Okay? Get the difference? So we're thinking, well, it's wrong anyways, the person died. What's the point? Now look how the Zera Shimshon says. The Zera Shimshon tells us that in multiple places, one of them being Tehillim, another place being in our prophet Yirmiyahu, refers to the enemies of the Jews as snakes. Interesting. That the enemies of the Jews are referred to as snakes. By the way, you know who knew this well? Paro. Much of the jewelry or ornaments or crown that Paro wore had snakes on it, cobras. So you may say, well, they lived in the desert, they had nothing else, but no, there's a lot more to that. Paro was a genius of an individual. He knew what and how to get or to try to beat the Jewish people. So on his crown, many don't know this, but Paro wore tefillin-like jewelry made out of gold. It was basically a snake that wrapped around his arm, and then the head of the snake came down his finger, similar to the way tefillin are. Very, very interesting. Okay? That's nor here nor there. I'm just telling you a very interesting fact. So the enemies of the Jews are referred to as snakes. Snakes as being sneaky, snakes as being as their power, their motive against the Jews. So now, listen to how the Zera Shimshon proposes. According to the Chachamim, according to the rabbis, that a person is exempt when they bring a snake to somebody else and that person now dies, according to that, then Hashem did not need to save us from the Greeks. Because when we were put out into exile, it was up to the Greeks, who are referred to as the snake, if they're going to decide to kill us or not. Right? Imagine, the enemies of the Jews are the Greeks. According to the rabbis, the Chachamim, that the snake can choose if he's going to attack or not, if the venom's going to come out or not. So therefore, God did not need to save us, and therefore we have an obligation to thank Him. But if you go according to the first opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, that a snake that is brought by someone, now that person is fully liable because the venom is, so to say, between their teeth. When God exiled the Jewish people amongst the enemies of the Jews, here in this case the Greeks, then God was putting us in a mortal danger immediately, and He would have had to save us, and therefore we wouldn't need to thank Him. So just as a recap, if we go according to the Chachamim, we would need to thank God because He didn't need to really save us. If we go according to Rabbi Yehuda, that a snake automatically kills, we would not need to thank God because God would have to save us because He put us in a mortal death. Okay? Now, based on this, the Zera Shimshon comes and answers our original question of the juxtaposition, the clear order of the Talmud. Remember, that's the height of the menorah, then the whole story with this pit of Joseph, and then going into which side of the doorpost does the menorah need to go on? The Zera Shimshon says that the law of the pit complements the law that preceded it, the law of the height. How so? Well, he says as follows. The Torah makes a big deal about Reuven putting Joseph in the pit. Now, let me ask you. I want to quote the verse actually. The verse says, it's in 37:21. It says as follows. It says, Vayishma Reuven, Reuven sees and he hears the sadness of his brother Joseph, Vayatzileo miyadam, and he saves them from his brothers. Vayomer lo nakenu nafesh. He says, let's not kill anybody over here. No one should die today. What does he do? He takes his brother and he puts him in a pit. What type of pit does the Talmud say it was? It was full of snakes. What good? How are you considered saving a person's life if you're putting them in a pit of snakes? They're going to die anyways. But the Torah says he saved Joseph. How are you saving Joseph by putting him in a pit of snakes? That's very good, no? Very good. So, according to this, the Zera Shimshon says that the halacha, the final verdict amongst that dispute of if a snake automatically kills or not, must be that it doesn't automatically kill, like the sages, like the majority opinion, like the chachamim. Okay?
A wild animal would also not attack or bite a tzaddik.
There we go. So that's another aspect to it. Yes, okay. So the Zera Shimshon says that the obvious halacha, the final verdict must be that, like the chachamim, that the snake does not automatically kill, doesn't automatically have venom. Rather, it chooses to draw it and let it out. That's how we can consider Reuven as saving Joseph by putting him in that pit. However, it must mean that we have to go based on that conclusion that when God exiled the Jewish people amongst and into the Greeks, that it wasn't obvious that we were going to be destroyed, and he didn't need to save us. And the fact that he saved us is that we need to thank him for it, and we need to proclaim in a public manner that he saved us from that. Okay, so you see how that all comes around. So specifically, the law of the height, which only when it's at that height or lower is it visible, can you be proclaiming publicly God's miracle. What does that have to do with the following halakha? The following halakha proves to us that you need to do it. It's not an option to do it. You need to do it because God, so to say, threw us to the snakes, but that was not a complete and mortal end. Rather, we had no choice but to thank God because God was the one who had the choice to save us or not. Okay? Based on this, two lessons we would want to prove from this is that although we find ourselves sometimes in hard situations and then we find ourselves get out of them, we need to always remember to thank God for it. It's not an option to thank God or not. Because at the end of the day, our wisdom, our money, our strength can't bail us out of every single problem. It is God, the one who helps us. It's His strength, it's His divine protection that helps us out of everything. This was the story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah is they came to attack us spiritually. They wanted to finish us off. You think that this war, as needed as it need to be that we have a miracle, it was still fully miraculous. We need to look at the things in our lives, the successes in our lives, as miraculous and as we owe the thanks to God. We don't have an option to thank God. That's the first thing I wanted to mention. Second thing I wanted to mention is that we have a mandate as the Jews to be an or lagoim, light upon the nations. Hanukkah, by the way, is a great opportunity to do so. It is a period of 8 days where we physically light candles, but we also are to internalize what that lighting is to mean. That means that we should be literally live candles everywhere we go, shedding warmth and light onto every single person we meet and encounter, whether they are Jewish or not. As a Jew, as a chosen people, we have the obligation to give others a good feeling about Jews, to make a kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name, opposed to the opposite. we have this obligation, and we can internalize this idea over the next 8 days of Hanukkah, internalize it and apply it to our lives. To finish off with something short, we do have a couple minutes left. This is a very nice chidush as well, the Zera Shimshon says. So let's continue. After Joseph was thrown into the pit by Reuven had to go back to his dad. Now the brothers were antsy. They wanted to kill him. They threw him in the pit, but they still weren't. They saw that the snakes weren't eating him, weren't killing him. So they said, we got to take matters into our own hands. So this is where Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, comes up with a great idea, and he says, okay, let's sell him to these Ishmaelite merchant peddlers that are passing by. Let's sell him to them. He'll be a slave. He'll be brought to the middle of nowhere. We'll never see him again. At least we won't have to kill him. Right? And this is what they did. They took him out and they sold him as a slave. There's a fascinating midrash, the Zera Shimshon quotes, but the midrash you'll soon see is like bipolar. Okay, watch this. The midrash says as follows. Rabbi Achva bar Zera Amar, so Rabbi Achva, the son of Zera, says, Averatan shel Shvatim, the sin of the sale of the Shvatim, the brothers of Joseph. Listen to this, the tribes, very good. Zechura hu leolam. It will always be remembered. No one will ever forget this tragic event and mistake that they have committed. And then it says, Tikva hi leolam. And it will be an everlasting hope. So one second. On one hand, we are berating the tribes and coming down on them for selling their brother. On the other hand, it's an everlasting hope. So it's going to be everlasting remembering and an everlasting hope. Something negative and then something positive. Within the same breath, the Zera Shimshon says that doesn't make too much sense. Fair question? Listen to his answer. He says, he bases this answer on another commentary the Zera Shimshon likes using, one of his favorite commentaries, called the Siftei Kohen. The Siftei Kohen was written by Rabbi Mordechai HaKohen, which lived in the 16th century. He lived in the city of Sfat, very holy, beautiful city, all those who visited. He lived in the city of Sfat in the 16th century, and he was a disciple of a famous rabbi named Rabbi Yisrael Kuriel, who was a direct student of the Arizal. Just so we put things into perspective. So Arizal, and then this Rabbi Yisrael Kuriel, and then his student was Rabbi Mordechai HaKohen, who wrote a very beautiful 2-volume, I have it at home, thank God, a 2-volume interpretation on the Torah called Siftei Kohen, literally the lips of the Kohen, because he was a Kohen himself. So he writes based on this, he quotes this rabbi, and he says that the rabbi writes, the Siftei Kohen, Rabbi Cohen, he writes that if it wasn't for the exile that Joseph endured when he left and when he was kicked out of Israel and he went to Egypt, the exile of the Jewish people would have been much more destructive, much harder. In other words, that thanks to the fact that Joseph was exiled, that first time, it made everything good for the Jewish people's upcoming exiles that would follow. Why? Well, he says that when Joseph left Israel and he was exiled to Egypt, God himself, he took his presence and he went and he exiled himself with Joseph in Egypt. And he brings a proof to this. He says that the Torah tells us in verse 39 verse 1, it says, Vayeshev hurad Mitzrayma, which translates to mean that Joseph was taken down to Egypt. The numerical value of Mitzrayma, which means to Mitzrayim, is 385. Why is that significant? Because the numerical value of Shekhinah, which means God's presence, is also 385. Alluding to that Joseph was exiled, God was exiled with him. So how does that do any good? Listen to the following. That the very fact that Joseph was exiled to outside of Israel, and that God took his presence and went with him, and that God will one day return, makes the Shekhinah, the Zera Shimshon explains, accustomed to the concept of exile. Because by the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, which both resulted in exiles, if that would have been the very first exile, you know what God would have said? Why am I going to put my presence in exile? Let's just let the Jews go out and then done with them. But for the very fact that Joseph himself was exiled, and Hashem said, I'm going to go with him, because Joseph suffered. Joseph was attacked. He was pinpointed. It was unjust what was done to him, at least when he was going through it. And God went along with it. Then God made his own presence accustomed to being exiled and one day returning. And so too we should know. The Zera Shimshon says that just as God exiled himself with Joseph that one time and came back, so too during this long exile, God will return along with all of us to Eretz Yisrael, to the Holy Land, in the time of Mashiach. A great lesson that we can learn from this, especially that as Hanukkah approaches, that we are to remember in this long exile, which is endured for almost 2,000 years, that God is with us even in the exile. It's a concept that is counterintuitive to us in one part. We spoke about this one time. The greatest punishment you can give your children is when you punish yourself along with them. Because then it's a true proof that you're doing it for their own good. For example, if you all plan to go somewhere or to do something, and your child did something so severe that warranted them not to come, leaving them back home is one form of punishment. But a greater form of punishment is staying home with them. Because then your child understands it's so severe that not only are they missing out, but the parent themselves is missing out. God does the same. When God puts the Jewish people in exile, he puts himself, so to say, in exile as well. And we have to know that God is here with us. When we know that God is here with us during the exile, that will give us hope to turn to him and to come back to him. I'll end off with a story. And the story is very true. The story is about the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav was a very, very famous rabbi, known for his deep extrapolation and interpretations of the Talmud and the Torah as well. The Brisker Rav one time saw a school child crying. Okay, something new? No, happens all the time. But out of his compassion, he went over to the child and he asked the child, "Why are you crying?" So the child's weeping and says, "I'm crying because we were playing hide and go seek with my friends, and I've been here for half an hour and no one came to find me." And the kid's sobbing and crying. Sounds like a good prank, right? The Brisker Rav writes, he says, through the tears and the crying of that child, I felt a fraction of the tears and the crying, so to say, of God. Why? Because God put himself in exile along with us. He's, so to say, in hiding mode. And God is so sad and so hurt. He's crying over the fact that most Jews are not seeking him out. The Brisker Rav said, through his tears and through his crying, I feel a little bit what God's going through. We need to make sure we don't contribute towards that pain that's brought on to God. We, thank God here, we seek God on a daily basis, every moment that we can, whether it's learning, fulfilling, doing good. But not everyone is. Not all Jews are. Let us take this Hanukkah, and the same way as we light not one and not two, but 8 days of Hanukkah. Let's see if we can reach out to at least 8 people in our life. That's a lot of people, right? But just one shamash and 8 candles. If we could, even over the course of our whole life, reach out to 8 other individuals and light their flame onto seeking our Creator even within the darkness of the exile. May Hashem bless us, that we will have a Chanukah full of light, Chanukah full of miracles for ourselves, for our children, our family, and all Am Yisrael. Thank you everyone for coming. Next week, we do have class, although it is To some, an auspicious day. To some, a horrible day. Maybe in honor of next week being it's Christmas. And, ironically, it is my English birthday at the same time. Joel's getting a kick out of it, right? Okay. We still have class Wednesday night, the 25th. Besides for the Zera Shimshon, maybe I'm going to give us and educate us a little bit on the history of the holiday of Christmas. Maybe you'll rethink if as a Jew you should partake in any of that celebration or not. I'm just going to leave us on that cliffhanger until next week. Hope to see everyone next week, and have a great rest of the week.